Good evening. So good evening to everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar on Game Changers, Recent Rock Art Discoveries in Kerry, Ireland, which will be presented by Aoibheann Lambe. So before we start, I'd just like to give you a little background to this talk. So this webinar is organised by Scotland's Rock Art Project, and Scotland's Rock Art Project is a 5-year programme working with communities across the country to record, research and raise awareness of prehistoric rock art in Scotland. The project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and is run by Historic Environment Scotland in collaboration with Edinburgh University and Glasgow School of Art. And we're very grateful to Glasgow School of Art for hosting this webinar on their Zoom account. We have a full house tonight, so we're all here. All the members of Scotland's Rock Art Project are present. So we have Dr. Tertia Barnett, who's the principal investigator of the project. We have Dr. Stuart Jeffrey, who's a Colban, also a lecturer and a collaborator from the and our data analyst Linda Biekert. The project started in 2017 and this is our final year, so we will be finishing in December. And as the last year of the project, we are organising a number of events to promote and celebrate Scotland's rock art and work and also showcase the work that our community teams have been doing throughout the 5-year period, and also the results of our research as well. So tonight's talk is the second one in the series of 12 webinars that we're running throughout the year. We will be hosting one a month. And these webinars are presented by experts from Britain and Europe on themes that are relevant to Scotland's rock art as well. So you can find more details about the whole webinar series and other events on our website. On our website, there is a link for an events page, and you can find all the details there. We will also be making these recordings available, and you can find recordings of our previous webinars on the website if you haven't been able to attend some of the other talks. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are just a few housekeeping things that I would like to make everyone aware of. So first of all, you may have noticed that we are recording this talk and we will be posting this on our website in a week or two. To avoid background noise, you will be muted throughout the webinar and your videos will be turned off. Please use the chat box if you want to talk to each other, to tell us where you're joining us from tonight and to flag up any technical issues that may arise throughout the talk, especially regarding sound. If there are any issues, please let us know on the chat box. We would also appreciate if you could keep the chat appropriate and relevant. So please do not post any URL links or click on any URL links that are not posted by us, as they may be spam. This is mostly directed to our Facebook page because we had a lot of spam links with our last webinar. If you want to avoid comments from the chat box popping up on your screen, then you can keep the chat box open on the right-hand side of your screen during the talk. And if you would like to ask any questions to the speaker, then please don't use the chat box, use the Q&A box, which is right next to it on the bottom of your screen. You can ask the speaker questions at any time during their talk, and we will then ask, so Aoibheann Lambe in this case, the questions at the end of the presentation. Yes. So chat box for chat, Q&A box for questions to the speaker. And now I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Aoibheann Lambe. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here today. So Aoibheann first became aware of rock art just over 10 years ago, and she began to survey rock art more intensively in 2014, and even has reported so far well over 100 rock art panels to the National Monument Service of Ireland, as well as other sites such as 2 stone circles, a copper mine, standing stones, a passage tomb art, and a rock shelter with rock scribings. Even has recently completed a research master's which focused on phases of carving and the ambiguity in rock art. And the talk that she brings today is still an ongoing research. And I am really excited to hear about this because it has a lot of new stuff. So Aoibheann, whenever you're ready.
Well,
thank
you so much for asking me. It's been such a fantastic, interesting distraction. I got a cough. It's been, really exciting for me to prepare for this talk, and it motivates you in a completely different way. When you actually you have a deadline, and there's some people going to be waiting. So thank you, everyone actually who's turned up today, because I'm sure you're all up to your tonsils with Zoom meetings. So. I'm telling this in a way as a story. It's kind of, in a way, part of the story. A lot of it takes place in the last 2 weeks, but it's against the background of all the research I've done before. And it starts in some kind of a way with, I'm going to have, with this panel in Chimera. So this was discovered and recorded in 2001 by Frank Coyne. And we'll come back to that, but that's the earliest recorded panel of the ones I'll be talking about, focusing on. Oh, listen, no, different. So here we have a map of Ireland. Now this is the rock art, and I've left a little bit of Britain in, and I'm sure when George Nash speaks, he can fill in some of the gaps for Wales, and I can also populate the Isle of Man at some point. But what's really important to me is I really want to know as close as possible what the original distribution of rock art was. So this is not a map that shows you where you'll find the panels now so much as where they were known to have been. And where we're focusing is in that little corner with the arrow and the full map of Ireland, and that's the peninsula in Kerry where I live. That's in Kerry, and it's called the Aoibheann Peninsula. And I never heard of rock art up until 10 years ago, and really I never heard of the Aoibheann Peninsula either. And if I had, I'd have called it something else. As Joanna would know, it's spelt in a way that you wouldn't expect to match the pronunciation. So where we start off the story is where the little icon shows you the panel, and then we're moving to the top of Aoibheann, which is that's where I've been doing all my field work, like really since 2014. It's an hour's drive from my house, and I hate to think how many times I've gone there, but it's like a really magical, wonderful place. And there were, in my study area, 6 rock art panels on record 6 years ago, and 65 on record now, and it's the highest concentration of rock art in any townland in Ireland. We have 60,000 townlands, and it's also very dense. But peculiarly, like anybody who knows who's been in a field, when you walk through it, it isn't like they all pop up and meet you. They can still be quite evasive. And then the bottom of the peninsula, that's where I live. So the story kind of takes place in all of these 3 areas. As Joanna said in her introduction, I've been totally taken up with ambiguity in rock art. It's really the thing that got me interested in the first place. So when I saw some panels and I saw, say, one with kind of like 2 rings on one side and 1 ring on the other side, it's like, what's going on? And then I saw the same kind of thing happening on different panels. So that's what really evoked my interest. And I've really put endless hours into trying to figure out, I used to try and figure out like, which is the correct way for this to look. So say with that same motif that's shown in 3 different ways there, I was looking for the one true way that would be the correct way, and then I would know what the artist had intended. It really took me a long time for the kind of eureka moment that the right way is the way it looks at the time that you see it in whatever light or conditions you see it. So there isn't one right way, and they're meant to be ambiguous, and they're meant to change in the light. So that was a great relief. I really would have saved a lot of time if I'd come to that thought earlier. And also by revisiting panels, which is something I do a lot. You know, you get to see more. So in fact, the experience gets richer, you know, the more you go back to the same ones. So in the top right, you can see where it's lichen encrusted, and that in flat daylight, that's the way the rock art often appears. And it's one of the reasons, and Dr. Tertia Barnett has pointed this out before, why maybe rock art just isn't so well known. It's so underwhelming, you know, when you see it in flat light, it's a kind of, you know, what am I looking at here? You know, there's nothing, you know. So, you know, people just aren't maybe that enchanted. And then when you use controlled lighting, and the effect you can see on the top there is the same as it would be by torchlight, flame light. It's almost like magical. The lichen bleaches away. It's like it just is not there. So you get a really good view of the art. So I mean, that's one of the benefits of something like photogrammetry, that you can make, you know, a finish that doesn't have any color in it, but you can, you know, achieve that also in the field just by artificial light. And by artificial light, you know, you see some things. Really, ultimately, natural sunlight, nothing is better for showing features. And this, that particular cup and 3 rings, that's been surveyed 3 times, and each time has been described as a cup and 3 ring motif. And I was just looking at it one day, and I was like, that's a spiral. You know, it actually does have a spiraling element. And then I showed it to some other people, and they all saw a cup and 3 rings. And I said, "You see spiral?" And they said, "Oh yeah, I see that now." And part of that's a very interesting motif. I could really give a lecture on that on its own, but I might be the only person interested. There's a kind of radial groove. There are actually 2 coming out of that motif, but one is much more pronounced than the other. And I believe that it was superimposed, and then the sides of the radial feature were incised later or braided. So it's they're actually more prominent by being erased. And this is something that has been described by Cochrane in A Passage to Context. So even no matter how dull the conditions are, that radial feature is very strong. So that's something you get with incised marks, because with picking, it's all individual little pick marks. You know, pop, 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 pop. It's kind of like joining the dots. But an incision, it's kind of a hard line. You know, the tool is drawn across the stone, and that somehow, even when it's very fine, it does enhance the visibility. No. Huh. Okay. And then you're also, I know that looking closely, there were just some extremely fine lines, and really, like, if you didn't know where they were, you know, trying to find them again kind of could be a job. But if you're kind of lucky enough to photograph them at the time. And so I don't know exactly how these were made or what their purpose is. But in fact, I've been finding an increasing number of them. And that's just a matter of having my eye trained in, you know, just, and like, they're definitely deliberately made. They're not anything that's accidental. And these are on surfaces that would not have been worked by machine. Like, there are no plow marks or any machine marks in these, they're too high up. And where that arrow is, that shows, excuse me, some of the spiral I just showed you is on that rock. And then just down slope from it is this other really small, insignificant looking rock, and it's got an incised ring in it. So I actually reported that to the National Monument Service in 2014, And it never got put on the record, because I'd say they thought it wasn't anything. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it was something like really different, like just didn't fit in with anything else. But I put out an appeal on social media, and then I was told about the incised rings here near Kenmare. So that was probably Elizabeth Toohey or Ken Williams who told me that. So where those arrows are, there are really fine incised rings. Now this is an interesting panel. It's kind of got quite a life story. So that might be some kind of machine or damage by natural causes. It's also got a lot of very faint cup and rings, and then more pronounced ones, which might suggest that they're made at different times. It also reminds me somehow of maybe more of a Galician style of rock art, and it's not typical of ours. And then when I went to visit at one point, somebody had pulled back the sod, so that's why you have that bleached effect there. See where it's really white? You see that in a rock, it's, you know, it's actually very vulnerable to erosion, but since then there's been soil creep, so that's been covered up. But what you can see is that the cup and ring marks and the incised rings are together on the same part of the panel, and they butt each other, and then there's one or maybe a bit more, you know, further down. So that's a second example, and there's about 1 centimetre in difference in diameter between that single incised ring in the other place and then this one in Kenmare. And a local man, Vinnie Hyland's really well known where I live, got a fantastic, you know, website and Facebook and everything. He had come across some incised rings probably 10 years ago. And again, there was like a kind of a zero reaction because nobody knew what they were. So they didn't know where to slot them in. So they're not with Rockart, they're somewhere else. So they're up on a hillside and they on a long stretch of outcrop. So I actually have been to see them the last couple of days. It's been really beautiful weather. So there is much more going on here than I could tell before. But there seems to be a cup and ring on a neighbouring rock. So that'd be really interesting if that then is also associated with rock art. But in and of itself, you know, it's in a lovely place. So it's on this, you know, overlooks, very little rock art overlooks Skellig Michael. One of the reasons is that, and maybe they just haven't been found yet, I mean, but it's a very iconic island in our culture, and you expect, you know, there'll be more monuments maybe directed at it. But this particular outcrop is actually overlooking a bay, and I have the arrows to show where the rings are, which I'm sure, unless you've got an incredibly big screen, you'd be able to tell. But while I was looking for those rings, Vinnie had said they're above the ship house, and when I went there, like it was like really needle in haystack. I happened to find this copper workings, so that's now on the record as a copper mine. So it was actually a very rewarding search. So there's been what I was going to talk about originally, but you know, to your disappointment, maybe I'm not, is you know, a really amazing rock art complex that's been discovered in Glencar. And the family found themselves, and they're just getting used to the idea, so they don't want publicity yet. So the report has gone to the National Monument Service, but it's kind of, I'm not doing social media on it and this kind of thing. But I've made about 12 models of the rock art on a stretch of outcrop that's 110 meters long, and then it's all covered in rock art, all different kinds of everything. But this is the closest maybe to a Rosette, but I think it looks to me, see how clear that motif is compared to the cup and rings elsewhere. So there are some indications here of possibly phases of carving. So there's incised rock art in this site, and we don't get incised rock art normally. It's all done by some form of picking. Now, whatever, you know, whether it's direct percussion or indirect, but a series of little taps made to the rock surface, whereas some of these examples are drawn. So where you can see in the photograph, the incised mark is very obvious. In the model, you can see that there are fainter features, a more classic rock art. In fact, really an awful lot of our rings are square, square rings, not round. And then this is has a diameter of 6 centimeters. So it's really just the size of a cup mark, and it's got a very fine ring, and it's one of about 4 at this side. So the family called them brooches, because they said they look like a brooch. Anyway, it's in this site in very good hands. The family are absolutely thrilled. Said it's like winning the lotto. So, and they will definitely be sharing the site, in due course once they just get around the idea. So we're going now to the Beara Peninsula, and the Beara Peninsula has almost no rock art. So it's just something that, I want to point out is that if we have this amazing survey in Ireland, the Archaeological Survey of Ireland, and we have all our monuments on it, and you can search by monument class. Now, you can't search 2 classes simultaneously, one at a time. So if you search for rock art, this is what you get. So then, and then Northern Ireland is a different government. So you have to, if you want to add it in, you get source your information elsewhere. So I try as much as possible not to have borders in my maps, because I'm trying to reflect the original distribution, the feel of the original distribution maybe. And so like one of the things is that Cork is really famous for its rock art. Well, look at that, So years ago, I was looking at this and saying, like, what the hell is this Cork stuff? Why? And then Finola Finlay, who's very well known in rock art world, she does this wonderful blog, the Roaring Water Journal, and she also does a lot of other work. And I was reading, I was on this beautiful island which has rock art called the Shurkin Island, and there's the Shurkin comment. And she had said, if you're wondering about why you can't find the panels in this island on the surveys, because they're listed as cup mark stones. So, that was a turning point for me. So a lot of these other dots are from a category called cup marked. So we've rock art and cup marked. So now you see that Cork does have a lot of rock art. And then also, if a panel is known only to its townland, so if it's now lost, or has been moved or can't be located, but there's a reliable source that tells us that it was in a townland, then I map it to the townland. So again, that's why I've got all these panels showing where they're known there. So I think it's very important to show the original distribution, because otherwise you're trying to list therefore there isn't, and that's not the case. They're just not there. And very exciting, like lots of new rock art finds being made around the country of exciting and new and different things, which I'll talk about another time. So the incised rings that we've seen are, say, at 3 corners of Ivra, and so that's, say, 20 kilometers, 40, say, one from the other. But because the local topography, it's it's really difficult to navigate the terrain. It's all mountains, there are only a few passes. So it's not 40 kilometers in, Norfolk or somewhere. And so also in prehistory, navigation would have been, say, over mountain passes. So say as the crow flies, the footfall that you might need to cover distance might be, I'm sure you can calculate it, like 5 times more, or 10 times more if you're doing this all the time. And so the Beara Peninsula is very little known rock art, and this is a newly identified rock art complex. So it's up near Pre-Sleep, and I'd love to have gone back there. It was intended to do a rock art safari there, bring out a whole lot of people. And so, Finola Finlay, I'll try and drag her out there. Maybe just the 2 of us will do a kind of a survey at some point. But very exciting, very little known rock art there. I think all of the rock art in Ireland is probably under-recorded, and it's very exciting that the Beara now isn't, I have to say, it's not so bare. So they're like way back, you know, when I was kind of early on, I had come to this panel, and I was actually with a geologist, and he said that it must have been an insect or something, and I didn't know enough about rock art, you know, so I didn't fight. So it only took me until quite recently, you know, to go back there and actually look at it. And then, you know, there's this kind of like maybe an incised ring again. You know, if you use a profiler, you know, that would say be used in ceramics to show the difference in depth. For all of these incised rings, like they're not fine enough, you know, they don't show anything. So I think that probably is rock art. It's in a rock art context. There are panels more than I've shown you there. And so kind of, you know, or not. I haven't you know, listed this. So my study area, where I've been doing all my work, I haven't been able to go back there since October 2019. So, you know, calamitous, and it's partly because of this water treatment plant that went up, and I did some work to try and get it stopped, but utterly, you know, without any success. And it's unfortunately the local people are so hurt with what's happened and what's to their landscape, so they're not allowing anybody at all up there now. So if you do want to visit, you know, the greatest concentration of rock art in Ireland, there's actually no access. So hopefully, you know, over time, you know, that'll all resolve itself. And then there's been the pandemic, so it's just been like nobody wants strangers coming around, and you know, especially where I live, it's so rural. If you see a strange car, you know what it is and why are they coming here, what are they doing that for. And so for now, you know, just haven't gone there. So I've been staying where I live, and so that's down here. It's the jewel in the crown, actually, of Aoibheann. So you know, it's no punishment. And actually, it's lovely to you know, spend a lot of time really in my close community, which is coastal and rural. So just a map to show you, give you a sense of the topography. So the two arrows show like the only passes through the center of the peninsula. So every, you know, say we are limited to 5 kilometers, like our 5 kilometers is like 50 kilometers. Because it's so hard to go anywhere. So it's very exciting. So this is the first rock art panel I ever saw, and it was also the first one recorded by Charles Graves. And it's a beauty, and I've learned a lot from that. I visited this panel. You know, if it's a beautiful day, you know, I'll just run up there and just have a look. You know, it's great to have them on your doorstep. And so beside it, there's I think that's 7 rock art panels in the area. And when the rock art was surveyed, this panel was actually recorded by the surveyors, and I couldn't find the rock art. Anyway, you know, I have to hand it to them, like that they even spotted. You know, they spotted one arc of one of these rings, and then on you know, on successive visits, I've seen that there are just more. And then, you know, before, like, say, you know, rock art might have been a case of, you know, it's really hard to find a cup and ring. My God, you know, it's hard to find an incised ring. Like, they're really, really elusive. So these photographs have been taken like in the best light that there is. So, you know, that's why you can even see anything. So the top bit and the bottom bit, that's unhighlighted, and this is the ring highlighted, you know, so you can make it out there then if you've got sharp eyes. So if I had seen them years ago, natural, you know, just something like a natural force. But of course, now that we've seen the incised rings everywhere else, know that they are in fact, you know, part of some kind of rock art. So this is the first panel that I ever recorded, and you know, it might sound like a boast to say it's the biggest area of rock art that outcrop that's inscribed in Ireland, but that's not a boast. What it means is that it's really obvious in the landscape. You kind of go, look at that huge bit of rock over there, I better look at some rock art there. That's all that was. And the rock art is very elusive because the surface is totally fractured. Like you can make out the rings in this, excuse me. And again, you know, that's really good light. So look at this huge expanse. So I've gone there, I don't know how many times, and since the lockdown, I've been going there much more often, and it's absolutely the case that every single time I visited, I find something new now, every single time. So just to show a few, there's like that really obvious cup mark I'd never seen, but it's only obvious because the light is right. Things I've seen also in the list panel, that there are cup and rings kind of going into cracks that I'd never seen before. And again, they're only, you can only see them in certain light, and then there's just marks in this that are really vague. But like the thing that really blew my mind was these incised rings. So my God, another panel with incised rings. So now it's becoming, you know, it's not a coincidence anymore. And this and the first panel I showed you are both ones with coupled rings and incised rings together. So they're on the exact same panel rather than say in association. So this is kind of the collection so far. And there are a few more as well, but these are the best. I'm trying to show images where you can see what I'm trying to show you, and you're not taking it on faith. And they're only quite different, each one. So, you know, the ones that on the top left are butting, and then the others are heavily intersecting. And there's actually more than I've highlighted there. So, you know, it's a real, it's the wrong word, but I'll say cacophony, you know, rings like, and then these ones also intersect more than I've shown. And they're also, it has to be said, very fine straight lines on these panels too. So I'm just showing really the rings because they're the things that are clearly anthropogenic. And then, you know, the lines could be caused maybe by scratches or something. So then I was looking at other panels trying to figure out, you know, if they could have been John Coyne, who recorded the first, that panel I showed you, suggested that maybe the incised rings were used as a marker and then worked into later. So this panel, you know, I had noticed that there was a kind of a perforation in the center before I had thought about it being incised. So that may have been incised, you know, and then worked over. But in fact, when I started looking for a roundish cup and rings, I just couldn't find any. So if it is the case that they were used as markers, it's kind of not hard to say now. And also their diameter is something like, say, 16 to 17 upwards. And these kind of rings tend to be smaller, like more like, say, 12 and 13. And so even if these are possibly incised, there's nothing convincing, and there's such a tiny minority. And then I looked at the passage tomb context, and there are some incised rings in the back of a curved stone, but Elizabeth Tuig says that they're definitely, or likely to be, say, medieval. And these ones, I superimposed that beautiful image. The stars actually ascend, you know, as far as you can see in that photograph. So I've murdered it slightly by cropping it. This sketch fab model, you know, the rings aren't perfectly compass drawn, and it's compass drawn kind of looking for really here. So they could have been done freehand, you know, even if they're quite precise. But we do have stone balls, so they are very precise. And then there'll be a talk by Hugo Anderson Weimark soon, so we learn like even more about them. So I'd love to know, you know, how they're made, how to do that. So we do know that in the Neolithic there was, you know, the know-how, at least in some quarters, and making such accurate incised marks. And Donegal too, you know, this is a series of sites that were recorded by Van Hook, and the lines are very fine, but I was only up there and I haven't been able to return. I wasn't able to get a good enough record or, you know, make a model or anything. So possibly incisions happening there. The more you sharpen the image, the more lines there appear to be. So it's a kind of a bit of an anomaly, and there are more of them as well. And then this is a nice one. In an earlier talk, I was talking about cross rings, and they deserve a talk on their own anyway. They're like very interesting. Michael Gibbons, archaeologist, he sent me this image from Galway. Now Galway has one known rock art panel, so to have an image of anything to do with rock art from there is great. And so that incised ring seems to be superimposing the other ones. And there's actually 8, that's got 8 radii, although you can't really see them. So 2 of these rings have 8 radii, the other 2 have a kind of a cross, you know, but the lines from the crosses extend beyond the motifs. They're not quite, if you like, normal cross circles. And there are other features which remain to be examined. So I will look forward to having a look at that panel in due course. This is a shot in the dark. I mean, this is Town Head. There may or may not be something incised on that, you know, and it's kind of not, you know, there's an overlap of a ring, but there's very possibly a kind of a ghost of a ring, but not really. Something is going on there, and it may or may not be connected to the incised ring phenomenon. And then I asked Manuel Santos Estevez, I'm not saying that name properly, I'll just call him Manuel, if there were any examples from Galicia, and there is, because somebody told me about one once, but I can't remember who it was, and I've lost that communication. So he sent that beautiful example as one that may have been used with, compass would have been used to create the rings. And then that's more classic rock art. So it may be that this came later or not. I put out a call on social media a few years ago, and then more recently, the Prehistoric Society, and then on the social media pages I run, County Kerry and Irish Rock Art. And John Picking came back with this kind of interesting one, because they are incised rings, and the upper one seems quite geometric. And that's from a kist cover in Monreath House in Port William, where I was a few years ago, and I never saw that stone. And that is 2-sided, so there's the other side of it. So that, you know, I'm interested, and I'll say this now rather than just at the end, any examples of incised rings in any context, actually, I'm interested. And then this is, because I've been looking at incised rings from all my records, I came across this, Le Chen style shield, and the spiral thing, it really troubled me how to match this up with any known spiral, because, it's a kind of a double spiral, and it actually doesn't match, say, any of the classic forms of a double spiral or a single spiral or any other spiral. And so it's only like, say, yesterday when I was looking at them and, oh my gosh, maybe this was a superimposition that happened in the Iron Age. Could the rings be from maybe the Iron Age? And then there's a famine. We had a famine in Ireland, series of famines in the 1840s. So people who were the poorest people were the ones who suffered most. And John Sheehan from UCC took Heritage Ivra, this is a group of which I'm chair, to visit this kind of famine village, Clocken, a few years ago. And I went into one of the houses, and somewhere along on the inside of the house, there were loads of like incised rings, just like the rings we found. And I was too embarrassed to point them out because I thought people would think I was like a rock art nut. And I can't find the photographs, but there is, and haven't been able to visit because of the travel restrictions. But in this famine village, on somewhere like on the mantelpiece in old plaster, there are a series of rings. So these rings can kind of turn up in all sorts of contexts. So there's another context then where you find incised rings, and it's these motifs, like, I think, look very like rock art. So like, if you saw that in its own and you were told was rock art, I don't think you'd doubt it. And even, you know, say this one, there's a series of incised rings, but there's, you know, sort of like a radial groove feature. And even a lot of it, there are multiple rings, and there's often a faint second radial groove, you know, often like there's one that's prominent, maybe more, and concentric circles and gaps in rings, and kind of like a bit of a gap and maybe a kind of radial feature here. So, and then there's a repertoire that extends beyond the forms that are classically similar to rock art. Although, you know, that's the Camina Rosa, are very, you know, it's almost identical to the swastika stone. Then there's a foot there for Heather. This is kind of called 6 petaled rosette, or a daisy hexafoil, or there's like a whole lot of names for it, but it's a geometric figure that's actually very difficult to make. So I tried to make some just to see how difficult they were. This is a mark that there's identical marks to this in rock shelters near where I live. And this is a mark from Pompeii. And all of these marks are go by different names, but they're kind of church graffiti that date, kind of, you know, medieval church graffiti. So they were put in certain points of churches as protection marks, and so they're sympathetic to the church. There's a researcher in this area, Matthew J. Champion. He says that the prayers in stone are solid prayers. So they also go by a name, witches' marks. Okay, so that makes them like creepy, heebie-jeebie, yuck, but that they're not. They're kind of apotropaic is the term, you know, and so I just call them protection marks. And how I came to even know about these, I don't know how many of you know about them, but I didn't. But then I didn't know about rock art until 10 years ago. So I was looking up incised rings because of my interest in these, and came across this photograph, this post, and then that led me to Antonia Thomas, and she kindly gave me permission to use this. This is from Orkney, and then, you know, I did a series of, you know, the searches continued, and then I had some search terms to use. So the daisy wheel hexafoil, and then I found, you know, an example in Ireland. There are some meant to be, but this is one in Tipperary, and that's in a children's burial ground, kind of creepy place. There are lots of, there's a holy well there. And then this is a standing stone from Kilmartin, and I just think the rock art like motif looks a little bit incongruous there, almost as if it was added maybe later. But so there you have this motif, which is found the world over. To the present day, it's found in Romania and Ukraine. There are conjoined ones on the temple of Osiris in Egypt. It's everywhere. So, but that's not exactly what we're talking about, you know. I mean, it's the incised rings and that overlap, but they don't overlap into this like perfect sort of daisy. So it was this book that when I was amazed, you know, when I saw these cup and rings, like, oh my God. So that's, you know, that's what got me, say, from the next level of interest in these protection marks. And then, like, there's lots of information and entertaining and informative talks, all, you know, online too. And then this man, David, a lot of the photographs that look most like rock art are taken by him, and they're from his page. And they're in areas where, like Suffolk, areas where I don't believe rock art is known to be. So these marks that look most like rock art don't tend to be in buildings which are in areas where rock art is found. And I just want to say that although I've concentrated mostly on incised rings, there are like no end of unusual forms that aren't just cup and rings in the Rockart of Kerry. And some of them like are so elusive, like really hard to see. So again, they have, they don't show any difference in profile. You know, they're kind of like they've got a depth of less than 1 millimeter. And it's almost like luck if you happen to see them. So this one is the one that's on the poster. It's actually a really elaborate panel, and it's one I really want to go back and work on again, you know, when restrictions lift, because there's much more. What I have shown, there's much more than that. And that's in an area where we're not allowed to travel at the moment. And I have to say, you know, it'd be a really good one for photogrammetry, but I'm unfortunate. I've kind of, somebody's offered to kind of sponsor me, and I'm going to get a really good camera out of it. So I'm really kind of delighted about that. So I'm going to be able to take really high resolution photographs, because you know, the models, I've done examples or experiments with models where I've used different resolutions, different cameras, and the quality is transparent, you know. So really the best image, you know, the better the image, the better the model. And this is like, I thought I was dreaming when I saw this, you know, it's kind of like a ghost of a cup and ring. But then when I went to the panel and lifted up some gorse, you know, there's some well-defined rock art. So there are marks like all over the place. And some of them, like this, might, you know, often it's like incised ring, you know, the least amazing or striking might be kind of, you know, kind of interesting in its way. But this is the only example I know of rock art which appears to be made by overhead percussion with very small point. Most of them are side on, you know, bigger strikes. And that's the closest I can think of is the passage tomb of 4 knocks, that kind of very light picking. So it's just unusual. And again, that's because, you know, really good daylight, you can see it, but otherwise you mightn't. So a question I could ask is if, you know, if the rings, you know, if the rings, say in the churches, if there's incised rings and the marks in the churches have a connection, could they, you know, give us a clue to the meaning and purpose of the rock art? And so here's an ogham stone, and that's found, the ogham markings are those, it's a form of early medieval writing, probably dating to the 5th century in Ireland. So each of the strokes corresponds to a letter. And so say this could be something that could tell us what everything else means, but it doesn't, you know, it just means something else. So, well, it says something on the lines of, it hasn't been properly deciphered, but something like somebody, son of somebody, which is kind of characteristic of them. So because something is found on the same rock doesn't of course mean it's in any way connected, but then it could be. So there are these panels up in Donegal. Bouke Roof, she's a Dutch woman and a photographer, and she made these wonderful examples and found them. And then with all the publicity that ensued and her interest in rock art, discovered that she had been taught in school by Martin van Hook. It was like a nice little come around. And so I was looking at this photograph and thought, God, is that a hand? You know, because we don't have any figurative things in Ireland, certainly no hands or feet that we know of. But that rock has since been covered up, so we won't be able to find out. And then this is, you know, a Christian figure. So, I mean, it might suggest that there's some kind of sympathy between the Christian figure and what was remembered or continued to be used, you know, to say the cup marks like that, that they kind of are, you know, complementing each other. And then when I was looking for examples of incised rings, I found this old photograph that I'd taken. It's terrible quality, but it might be the most interesting photograph actually of the talk, because it's a medieval church slab, you know, it's an incised ring, but it's actually got cup marks picked out in it. So there are 3 cup marks, and they had to have been done after that was created as a cross slab. And we've never had any indication, you know, as far as I know, of rock art being able to, whatever about the earliest date for rock art, you know, we haven't also had really like the latest date for rock art. And so what's said about these marks is that St. Gobnet, or St. Bridget, probably St. Gobnet, would pray on at the cross and put her elbows into the hollows. And that's something you see over and over again. Saint stones all over Ireland. Did a whole load of research on this in the past. The association between rock art and kind of religiously stuff, churches and mass rocks, and the hollows on stones that are associated with saints can be cup marks, and they're nearly always attributed to a knee or an elbow mark, which, you know, could have some distant clue as to what cup marks were originally. So this is back again to, you know, all of our marks. So I'm concluding now, really. So I just, you know, these, I think they're very interesting. I mean, I think this is completely new to me. I mean, I've only known about these like within the last 2 weeks, so it's terribly fresh. Now, it has to be said that so far, I'm not aware of any of these in Ireland. So Brian Hoggard, one of the book titles, one of his books was shown earlier. He said that he had seen some interlapping rings in a church in Youghal in County Cork. And I've been on to the tour guide for that, Wayne Ruxton, and he said he'd have a look, but he said he'd only get back to me if he found something, so he mustn't have. But I'm extremely confident that these marks are probably to be found in churches like all over Ireland and other buildings. And so I'm hoping that, say, in Heritage Uvra, we'll start a little project, say locally, and then try and link up with other heritage groups and, you know, do a kind of a Ireland-wide survey. Because a bit like the rock art, you know, they're very elusive, you know, these marks, like all these photographs, like they've had a torch, you know, there's a torch is illuminating what you can see. So they completely understand that they can be overlooked. Now, I made some phone calls to some of the more prominent medieval churches, but they I'm not going to do it that way. You know, I'm going to like do it in a very formal way, because, you know, you start talking about marks and protection marks, you know, people get nervous. So if the protection marks are something like to trap a bad spirit or to confuse them, like that completely explains a whole lot of rock art to me, if there is a connection in that respect. Like I just put some arrows there, you know, but so where some lines are coming over. Now this is, again, you know, it's from Spain, but, you know, isn't it astonishing? And like, wouldn't you go dizzy looking at it? You could see how something like that could, you know, thwart you if you're trying to maybe enter something. So as to quite what was being entered, you know, that's kind of whether, you know, if, like, say, the rock was an access to the underworld and to stop people, like, or spirits coming out or going in or being in the environment. But I'd say there's a good chance there is something to do with confusion. You know, I've spent so many years kind of collecting all these proof that rock art is ambiguous. And at the end of the day, you know, it was like, okay, it's ambiguous, you know, it's really ambiguous. But then I think this does give a motivation for doing that. So, like, I used to think that rock art might have been directed at maybe groups, you know, so if you're not from my clan group, then you won't understand the ambiguity, or, you know, you won't see it, and therefore you're not part of it. But maybe it wasn't, you know, they're not addressed to humans at all. So to recap, you know, we have incised rings then coming from all sorts of chronologies. So we have them, you know, in the incised rings and stone balls from the Neolithic, and then we have, we think, I'm going to, yeah, then Bronze Age shields or something. There's lots of stuff in the Bronze Age, you know, with concentric rings. I mean, once you know the technology is there, they're going to turn up over again. There's like very geometric rings in inlet 10, and then in possibly, you know, it might be in medieval context, but certainly on the cross slabs, you've got the rings. And then you also have them, you know, as I saw in this house from the famine era. So their incised rings are turning up all over the place, and of course turning up on the church as well. So it's possible like that they, you know, the rings that we have on the Rockard, then we have to wonder when were they placed on the panels in relation to the Rockart. So if they were, you know, there's a number of scenarios. If they were contemporaneous, say as Francoin, you know, proposed, maybe used to mark out, you know, coppin rings, which really could be the case, you know, because they're so elusive that maybe a closer study might show, like, you know, remains of them. They may have been another type of rock art, just that one we just haven't clocked so far. It's possible, of course, that they're only exclusive to like the 6 sites that I've told you about today. I think that's extremely unlikely. And also, if that's another one in Beara, you know, we're getting towards Cork, you know, we're leaving this peninsula and extending into another one. And then the example from Galway, you know, that incised ring is really very similar in style. So, but it remains to be seen. And then if they were added later, like in why or how or what went into adding them later. So what's interesting is that if they were added later, that people knew about rock art, because we didn't know about rock art until, you know, Charles Graves told us here in Ireland. So they seems, you know, because of the different locations for all these incised rings does suggest a widespread knowledge at the time those rings were made about the phenomenon of rock art. So like one kind of corny idea is that maybe they're made, you know, during the famine. You know, the rings on that house, you know, would have dated from maybe that house would date from something like between 1750 and 1840. And if the rings, say, were made in that era, you know, maybe like, you know, our current time, pandemic, you know, time of desperation, maybe people turn back, you know, to an earlier system, you know, just like trying anything. But, you know, whether or not that's true, it would have had to have happened simultaneously, or like at a lot of, you know, geographically disparate areas. Then there's the chance that there was continuity, you know, that kind of up until rock art was forgotten, and I'm sure it was really a taboo. I think it's no question but that, you know, there was a lid put on it. That maybe there was a kind of a continuity, and that even if the rings were added more recently, that there was a sympathy to the original meaning and purpose of the rock art, which may have been then linked to the church. There's something to do with like protection marks. I suppose then if we now have to consider the relationship of the incised rings then to, you know, the protection marks, or the rock art, the protection marks. And I mean, I think it's uncanny that there's so many rock art motifs, like even down to the radials, the concentric rings and everything in those protection marks, that is uncanny, or, you know, it is remarkable. And so that remains to be seen. And I then concluding, okay, well, last slide, passage tomb context, you know, the zigzags there where the arrow is, those lines, you know, they're beautiful in the beginning and they're all like parallel, and then they go, you know, skew with at the end. So that may also be, you know, designed to confuse, you know, the unwanted. So if you're still there, and Joanna is anyway, thank you very much, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Aoibheann. That was very, very interesting. I'm really intrigued by these very fine circles that you've been finding. Let's now move to a few questions that popped up in the Q&A box. We have about half an hour for questions, if you're happy with that.
Yeah, yeah. What time did I do it in?
Great. So you were great. You took just an hour, so that's perfect.
Right.
So Helen Roberts says that when these are discovered, does this mean people have uncovered the undergrowth for other purposes and accidentally come across them, or do people go out and purposely survey them, maybe with contemporary records that are themselves pretty old? It's amazing to think that we can still discover things that have been hidden so long.
Well, I suppose, I mean, my own policy is I don't lift the turf because the stone is very vulnerable, you know, underneath. And you can see in all of those photographs, apart from where there was the soil was lifted, that they've all lichen encrusted. They're actually really well established. So it was a case of just really looking, you know, they're there all the time. There's plenty to see, you know, without having to lift the scrub. And the lichen growth is very slow because there are some panels exposed in Derry na Blaha in the 60s. And so we have photographs from them then. And to this day, like, they still look like they were exposed yesterday. You know, the accumulation is very slow. But of course, we have thousands of different species. So to date it, you know, is another matter. So I think much of the rock art can be found just by looking. That's why partly I do the rock art safaris. You do need a bit of help in what to see, you know. And it's really good to start off going to a place where there's lots of rock art, to get a feel, you know, for an area where it is, and, you know, enjoy it. You know, it's not a bit enjoyable looking at rocks if you're looking for rock art, not finding it.
Definitely. Gary is asking if there are any tools ever recovered which may have been used to create the designs.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I did forget to say when I was thinking about the chronology of rock art, when Blaise O'Connor did her excavations in 2003, she did find evidence, you know, for activity into the medieval around the sites, and that was in the form of maybe pottery. So, and in terms of tools in excavations, really more in the UK. So excavations conducted by you know, Bradley with Aaron Watson, Ben Lawyers and Coptow. And they're all, if you go to the ScRAP, Scotland's Rock Art website, there's a really good account of all the excavations. It's fantastic, actually. It's a really good resource, you know, to get them all there. So you get the information, so you get what's been found, what's been interpreted. So Hugo Anderson Weimark, who's going to be speaking shortly, he's done lots of experimental archaeology and with tools, and he's found tools and he's documented them. So I'm sure there'll be, you know, an expert on lithics will be able to provide great information on that.
Yeah, thanks for the reference. We do have a short section about some of the excavations that were carried out around Rockart, which aren't that many, you know, if we put them all together. So Andrew is saying that he's doing a research on 6 petal rosettes, which date back to the Bronze Age, and it is assumed that compasses were used to inscribe them. Do you think there is a link to the inscribed rock art panels?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be too much to say that, like, the few panels I found were the prototypes for the rosette that got to be known worldwide and went to Egypt. But they, you know, there's also Euclidean geometry, you know, where you have intersecting rings as well. So there's whole concepts of sacred geometry. No question, I think, but that you need a compass to make those rings. Like, I've tried different ways of making those rings, partly because I was trying to think, say, if somebody had heard about the ring but hadn't seen one, you know, would they be trying to make one? Yeah, but I don't at all believe that. So I think that for whatever reason these rings intersect the way they do was intended to be that way. It might have been just, the purpose might have been just to confuse, and then you know, I don't know, I would have thought that they would have evolved then into a more formal geometric shape later, but then we do have those early examples as well. So it is interesting, but the inside compass drawn for sure, yeah, and with a very fine tool, you know, so not just compass drawn, but you know, there might only be 1 millimeter or less, you know, the ring in width.
Yeah, there are a few there are a few other people asking whether you think that they were compass drawn. So I think you've answered that question. But Lorraine,
perforation in the center of most of them, you know, and actually one of the rocks, they kind of there's a double ring in one bit where they've kind of maybe done the whole turn and haven't quite matched up where they started.
oh.
So there's a little,
Yeah. Still on the compass questions, Lorraine is asking whether perhaps they could have been done with a mental compass, which probably, you know, potentially would mean that they were perhaps done during the Bronze Age. What do you think about that?
I contacted Hugo Anderson Weinmark years ago about this, actually, and so it seems they kind of been, he'll answer this, I'll ask him. There seems to be no reason why they couldn't be made with flint tool. You can have something like you know, piece of wood in a point, and you can rotate it and have it attached to a sharp tool and draw it around. You don't need a metal tool.
You don't need a metal tool.
And we have the Neolithic stone balls, okay? You know, so they're incised rings. So we have an artifact that, you know, we believe is Neolithic.
That's true. That's true. So there's another question here about the distribution of the rock art. So they are asking, why do you think there is so much rock art in the very south and very north, and has other rock art just not been found yet in other places?
Yeah, I've done lots of studies on this, actually. So I've done comparisons with other monument classes, prehistoric only, so I've, say, taken out of the equation, you know, anything that's post-Iron Age. And so you'll find that where there's a lack of rock art, there's a lack of prehistoric monument as well. So I'd say there's a lot to do with taphonomy, you know, that especially in fertile land, they huge clearances. So quite a lot of rock art has been found in Carlow. It's very fertile land, but it's all been found in built into walls and broken up, so it's not in situ. And in Donegal and Kerry, the land is poor, and so it just hasn't been developed so much. Say where I live, over say 6 years, I've reported like 12 rock art panels, and that's lowland settlement area. They're the lowest elevation sites, amongst the lowest elevation sites in Ireland, the ones I've reported here. But they've taken me, if you like, over the course of 6 years, lots and lots of surveying, whereas I can go to an upland area and find them in an afternoon. So it's, I think, I'd like to, you know, I'm really interested in that. I'm really invested in that. Like say in Louth, Laois, there was only one panel known until recently, and Helen Rowe had reported some back maybe in the 30s. So there was just a little account in her notebook. And then I saw that somebody was researching Helen Rowe. We got in contact, then went through the archives, and she sent me from her notebooks 2 records, and plus the Laois Library has a photograph of the rock art. So that was really exciting. So there, you know, getting evidence that substantiates, you know, claims of rock art in areas where it's not known, especially like low-lying fertile areas. So I think a lot of people disagree with me on this now. I've had a few fights, but I do think that I think there was more rock art than we know. Even in Tipperary, there's no known rock art in South Tipperary, but there was a pick-marked stone found in excavations at Windmill Hill, that's near Cashel, and also in a wedge tomb that was excavated by M.J. O'Kelly. There are cut-marked stones inside it, so they're not listed on the survey as rock art, you know, they're kind of artifacts. So, you know, really maybe I should map them as well, but I don't want to, you know, I'm strict with what I map, you know, it's very much rock art, you know, that
yeah. Okay, thank you for that. There's another question about what is the digital processing that you use to your images to enhance your images and extract them? So how do you treat it?
Well, I mean, sunlight is usually the best. And And so what I've done is, I'm not quite sure which they're asking. Is it to sharpen the images or to put the highlighting right?
I suppose it's, yeah, how do you kind of, I suppose perhaps the question, I don't know, Gary wasn't more specific, but I guess perhaps about the very fine circles, if they're so difficult to kind of visualize, how do you enhance them with your lightning maybe? Have you tried?
I find, sorry, with, I need sunlight for them because they're so fine and there's little bits of moss on the surface. So if you try and use control lighting, the little bit of moss casts big long shadow. So there's something about sunlight, it's a quality that I'm sure some poet must have described, but it's fantastic. It highlights features in rock art that nothing else does. So because I live close to those panels, I would run up there when the weather is right and take images, you know what I mean? And then to sharpen images, I would bring them into Lightroom. And I would just do just the function, you know, you can just do a sharpening. So it doesn't distort or change anything.
Okay.
And just bring it up a bit.
Yeah, it's really, I can imagine that they're probably very difficult to spot. I have to say, I have visited one of the rocks that you talked about, and I don't think I spotted them. So not even in the 3D model. So
yeah, no, and I've tried to make 3D models, and I went to so much trouble. You know, I printed out all those little funny symbols, you know, put them all around the place, and ranging rods, everything to help the program recognize where it was, you know, in this kind of blank sea. And so really I've used photographs because so far that they're better.
Yeah, maybe reflectance transformation imaging might be a good one to try there, because it can pick out very fine details. Like one of the things too is where these rocks are, especially the higher one, you know, there's like a lot of livestock around and it's really boggy, and you just don't like going up there in dark. It's just not nice, you know, when you're walking, you're kind of squelching up to your knees, you know, in this really soft ground, and so were they better placed, I probably would have done a lot of that. Yeah. So just a few more questions. Deborah is saying that on the checkerboard, so that slide where you presented all the different rings, the sixth photo on the top line looks like the nest of Brodgar butterfly, and she's asking if this is a carving from Ireland. Okay,
I have to apologise for that. When I was looking at it today, I was thinking, God, that looks like the nest, you know, it's like the butterfly. And really what it is, it's a mark that's called a Marion Mark. It's associated with the medieval church graffiti, and it can, Matthew Champion disputes if it even exists, because he says that this mark is like a double W was actually how the W was written anyway. And it's interpreted in some corners as the Virgin of Virgins. So it's not the butterfly.
Yeah. So Finola, whom you've mentioned in your talk, is with us today. And she is saying that she will now be looking at rock art even more closely. And she says that while many circles are a bit approximate, one of the panels that look like they may have been laid out with a compass is Rathgerin. I apologize, I'm probably mispronouncing this, as they are very precise. And she's asking if you have looked at this one.
I was actually looking for images of that, and I've seen it in reality, in dull weather conditions. And it's something that Christian Cornish has observed in his book on the rock art of Leinster, that the more rings you have in a motif, the smaller the central cup is, you know, the Irish corpus. So Drum Carbet up in Donegal has got 10 concentric rings, and then we only have like 8 examples in the country with 7 concentric rings, like really rare. And Rathgerin is a beautiful example because it exhibits also this kind of plasticity where the rings appear to drape down the sides of the lozenge-shaped boulder. So they, again, are quite tricky. They know a little bit like the Galician example. The Rathgerin rings aren't quite as round as you think. Now they have that ambiguity thing happening.
Yeah.
But I would say they were definitely drawn with, absolutely, I would say they were drawn with rings. The more, that and Drumcarpet would be the two main examples I would pick as likely. But I didn't have any overhead images, you know, where I would have shown all the rings kind of coming out. And they may also, they're so particular, those multiple ring motifs, they're so uncharacteristic, you know, of everything else. And I haven't looked actually, maybe, you know, Guillaume probably would know all about it, if there are compass drawn concentric rings and passage tomb contexts. Yeah, the few I can think of would seem to be more freehand.
Okay. So Luke is asking if you think that it is possible that this type of rock art is linked to astronomical activities.
Well, a friend of mine, Lenny Stapleton in Clonmel, insists that the rosettes were made by spaceships, but he's only joking. And I'm certain that the rock art is connected. It is connected to, you know, it has an astronomical connection in terms of certain motifs and certain panels are illuminated only at certain times of year. So I've seen a lot of that because of going to the same two panels all the time. There's in the Liss rock art panel, there's a crack which looks like it's just broken. And then at sunset on the equinox, when the sun just at that time of year shines directly down that crack, and I can see 3 cup and rings in it. Which never look like cup and rings, whether you use artificial light or not. And they don't even look like cup and rings in 3D models either. So it was just the natural light at one time. And other panels, like a panel I studied closely in my study area, that is only fully illuminated at sunset on the winter solstice. So otherwise, it's stepped. Otherwise, one of the steps will always cast a shadow on itself, so you'll never see it fully except at that time. And lots of examples, actually. So if that's answering the question, as to whether there's star maps now, that would be completely different. Clive Ruggles, you know, his answer to that was when he was in Australia. You know, he was shown an emu, you know, some rock art, and then they he said, "What's that?" And they looked up at the stars and they said, "See, it's the emu." And he was like, nobody would ever think it was an emu, at least nobody, like, you know, who wasn't part of the culture. So even if something is a map, it isn't to say it's going to be a literal map, you know, the way we see things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So just a few more questions. We have lots of questions on the chat. I'm afraid we probably won't be able to, you know, ask you all of them. But I will, you know, keep going and ask you as many as we can within the time that we have available. So Richard Stroud, hi Richard, is saying, are the circles confined to flat surfaces? And if so, do you think the diameter is determined by the available flat area?
Hello, Richard. Richard has been great contact for me, I have to say. You know, he's always available to answer any question straight away with like way more information than I could have hoped. So thank you. But actually the very first example I showed of the single ring, that surface isn't even really that flat. But I have to say, something I saw yesterday, you know, astonished me. So what it was is the diameter is not circumscribed by, I don't think exactly, by the available space, you know what I mean? So the ones I was looking at yesterday with the view Skellig Michael, it had been raining, the sun was shining, you know, the surface, you could see the rings really well. And it really looked as if the surface had been scrubbed over with like a wire wool or something. There were lots of swishing marks, which I hadn't really examined before, but now I think they're completely deliberately made. You know, maybe the surface was worked and then leveled and then polished afterwards. Because when all the rest of the outcrop is quite irregular, you know, just the normal local surface topography, whereas where those rings are is like satin smooth. So the rock is, the rings are there because the rock is flat, and the rock is flat because they made it flat.
Okay. So Kim is asking if these incised rings appear in other countries. She's not talking about the cup and rings, but you know, the fine ones that you've mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I'm, you know, asking people to tell me. So yeah, I mean, John Picking sent me that example from Unreath House, which, you know, I was delighted to see, even if it wasn't exactly, you know, it's getting it, for a start, you know, that stone is actually quite interesting. You know, its provenance isn't exactly known, but it was part of the antiquarian Herbert Maxwell's collection, and it's inscribed on both sides. And it looks to me like in that rock that there was a cup and ring motif that was very weathered, so, you know, it was repurposed. And then it seems like the clearly defined cup and ring motif was, it's probably incised over an earlier one, you know, modern, kind of just to emphasize it. And so in that case, I would say the rings probably are contemporaneous with the reworking of the cup and rings. So they would be, you know, dated to the time they kissed. There's never going to be a clear-cut answer in rock art, I think.
Yeah.
Something.
Thank God.
That's great, thank you. Just a couple more questions. Do you think that rock art is contemporary to passage tomb art? It always comes across as a poor cousin to passage tomb art.
There, you know, I've done a whole load of research. I've got that I want to write up on that. So I think that there are lots of, you know, overlaps. I'm not going to answer that question quite yet, because that's part of the work in progress.
It's a very big question anyway, isn't it?
It's, you know, like, there's all sorts of ideas, you know, that rock art came first and then it was repurposed. I think what's interesting, I mean, you know, not to be ignored, is the reverse of the curbstones, you know, in Newgrange, you know, with cup and ring marks, and Loch Crew, you know, is also kind of like a missing link. So Elizabeth Tuig has done some really interesting work on the rock art in Meath and its relationship to the passage tombs in Loch Crew. So I think she comes out with there being largely kind of contemporaneous. Like in the passage tomb complex there, you can get rock art panels within 100 meters of, you know, Cairntee. So they're connected, you know, there's open air rock art and passage tombs, like, and the rock art inside the passage tomb is very like the open air rock art. So there's like a really strong synergy there. Very interesting area, of course.
That is great. There is another question here, but I think you kind of answered it earlier. Have you photographed any of these images at the winter or summer solstice? How are they different, and or what is revealed in that light?
Okay, well, actually something that I noticed only this year, because I've been able to go to the same panels over and over again, is I started making videos, you know, at like sunset, you know, and then watching things in fast motion afterwards. And there's a beautiful monumental panel in Carradaniel where I live. And you can see this, you can actually see it if you go back on the slide to the first Liss image, that you can get huge rings, you know, maybe a diameter of 40 centimeters that are kind of a little bit elusive, you can't always see them. So on the Carradaniel panel, as the sun sets, all the cup and rings are highlighted, and then for a short period of time, some really large rings kind of appear, and then they're gone, and then it's back to cup and rings, and then sunset. So I have that recorded. So that's kind of very fleeting. That's one of the things I love about rock art, you know, is the it's carved in stone, and yes, there's like a very ephemeral quality about it as well.
That's right. It very much depends on the light, doesn't it? You've been talking about it quite a lot, and it is amazing what the light can do when we're looking at these things. Yeah. I have to say I was very unlucky, because when I was when I visited Yvres, I had lots of very grey day, so there wasn't much light to look at anything, to be honest.
And I was on an excavation for a whole month that time, so unfortunately it's terrible, and I wasn't able to show me around.
Yeah. So just one last question. Deborah is saying, does the northeast southwest preponderance of Rockart not link to the copper trade across to the southern end of the Great Glen and then up to northeast Scotland? Kilmartyr Glen is on a trajectory and full of Rockart too. Do you have anything to say about this? I suppose this is it's not quite what you were specific to what you were talking about today. But I suppose because you mentioned the copper mines, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a relationship between the Rockart and the copper mines?
I'm really interested in copper mines, you know, so I do quite a lot kind of like probably going to be, you know, in a project with them here. So the copper mines are very few and far between. Like we've only got 75 copper mines in the whole of the country, and of them then there's only, it's like smaller quantity, about 50 which would be considered primitive. We've got 1,000 Rockart panels, you know, and they're not, you know, they're not in the same location. And then I contacted the mining, not quite sure the name of the group, but Paul Rondeles is part of it. They have a Facebook page, and I contacted them about asking them if they could, if they knew anything about miners' marks, you know, because on the outcrop leading to the copper mine, you know, because of those marks. And the response was like, kind of on the lines of, do you think the miners are going to tell people, you know, where the copper is? So, because actually, if anyone has any information on miners' marks, because you hear about them as if it's a fait accompli. I mean, I've had loads of people saying to me, oh yeah, oh, Rockart, yeah, miners' marks, yeah. But I don't know what the root of all of that is. You know, if it's fantasy or does it have, you know, any basis in fact?
Yeah, there are some researchers who do associate the creation of Rockart with, you know, the people moving around looking for metal ores, and particularly copper, right in the beginning.
I mean, Mac White did in 1946, but you know, at the time the known distribution in Ireland was like tiny, and it was. Yeah, I mean, it was very speculative. You know, there wasn't any actual reason to believe that there was correlation, you know, that could stand up.
Yeah, well, I think we've reached the end of this webinar. So it's just 7 o'clock now. So I think, unfortunately, there's no more time for any more questions. I'd like to thank Aoibheann for your wonderful presentation. Really, a big applause. It's one of the things that I miss is people clapping at the end. these Zoom sessions. But thank you so much for your presentation. It's really interesting, and I personally have lots of questions, but I'll save that for a later date. I'd also like to thank all the attendees, everyone who joined us today, and obviously all the other members of the ScRAP team, which is great to see us all together here tonight. I'll just remind everyone that our next webinar will take place on the 29th of March, and it will be delivered by Dr. George Nash, and the title of the next webinar is Wales a Prehistoric Rockart Backwater?
No.
So thank you very much for coming and seeing us, and we hope to see you on the 29th of March.